I walked into my childhood home expecting the smell of pine needles and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that clings to you in December and makes the cold outside feel earned. Instead, I walked into a wall of air so cold it stole my breath, 10 degrees below zero outside in Minnesota, and it felt exactly the same inside. My eyes burned instantly. My breath fogged in front of my face like I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor and stood there, listening. Nothing. No music, no furnace hum, no voices, just absolute silence, heavy and unnatural, like the house itself had given up. That's when I saw it, a single sheet of paper on the kitchen counter, weighed down by a set of keys. I picked it up with fingers already going numb. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, soft loops, careless swirls, the kind of writing you use when you're relaxed and excited, not when you're abandoning someone. It read, "Don't wait up. Handle the old man. No explanation." No instructions, just that. My chest tightened so fast it hurt. Panic didn't creep in, it slammed into me, cold and sudden, sharper than the air in my lungs. I didn't stop to think. I ran down the hallway toward the back room, the one they'd shoved Grandpa George into 3 years earlier, when he became too much work. The door was shut. I didn't turn the handle. I kicked it open. The sight hit me harder than the cold ever could. He was curled into himself on a bare mattress, wrapped in thin sheets that did nothing to protect him. His lips were blue. His skin was gray, waxy, wrong. He wasn't moving. I dropped to my knees and touched his neck, my hands shaking as I searched for a pulse. It was there, barely, weak, fading. As I tried to steady my breathing, I looked up at the wall. The smart thermostat panel was dark, lifeless, except for a tiny red light blinking in the corner. Disabled. They hadn't just left him alone. They had turned off the heat on purpose. In Minnesota. In December, to save a few dollars while they drank cocktails on a beach in Bali. This wasn't neglect. This was a decision. And standing there in that frozen room, holding my grandfather's freezing hand, I understood something that changed everything. They didn't forget him. They calculated him. Before I tell you exactly how I made them pay for that decision, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far the story travels. I've spent 10 years in some of the harshest places on earth, patching soldiers back together in the desert while chaos raged around me. I've seen bodies broken in ways that make most people flinch, felt the weight of lives resting in my hands when seconds mattered more than hours. That experience teaches you something no textbook ever can. Panic is a luxury. Fear is a tool, but only when it doesn't take over. It's easy to think you're calm until the moment you're training is the only thing standing between life and death. That day, standing in my grandfather's freezing room, all of that experience came rushing back. The panic that gripped so many would-be heroes didn't touch me. I didn't hesitate. I acted. I wrapped him in emergency thermal blankets, the kind I always carry, the kind that have saved lives in combat zones and snowstorms alike. My hands worked instinctively, rubbing his chest and hands to generate friction, to coax warmth back into a body that felt more like marble than flesh. Every motion was deliberate, every touch measured. I could feel the pulse return in a faint, steady rhythm under my fingertips, but I didn't celebrate. I didn't even allow myself relief. There was no room for emotion yet, only action. I dialed 911, giving the dispatcher my address, his condition, and my exact location. Elderly male, severe hypothermia, unresponsive, I said, repeating it as if saying it twice might ensure they understood the gravity of the situation. 12 minutes was all I had. 12 minutes stretched like an eternity when you're holding someone you love and watching life slip through fragile threads. While I counted his shallow breaths, I let my mind work faster than my heart could react. I checked every small thing, the angle of his body, the thinness of the blankets, the frost forming along the windowsill, the faint red light on the thermostat panel. Every detail told me a story. Every small clue confirmed what I already feared. This wasn't neglect by accident. This was deliberate, a calculated choice. My heart tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. I had seen planning like this before in the field, quiet, efficient, lethal in its own way. But here, it wasn't the desert. It wasn't a battlefield. It was my family home. And the threat was personal. The sirens started far off, slicing through the frozen stillness of the neighborhood, growing louder with every second. I heard them before I saw them, their wail carrying over the wind and snow. The sound brought both relief and clarity. Relief, because help was coming. Clarity, because I had time now, not to panic, not to act recklessly, but to think, to observe, to document. This wasn't just a case of bad parenting, a lapse, or a cold house. This was a crime scene. The evidence was all around me. Every neglectful choice, every calculation, every act of cruelty left traces that would speak for themselves if I was careful. Every missing prescription, every frozen pipe, every disabled thermostat was a piece of the puzzle waiting to be put together. As I sat there, holding his trembling hand, the weight of years of preparation and experience settled over me. This was a moment I had unknowingly trained for my entire life. While the ambulance cut through the icy streets, I started collecting evidence, silently cataloguing everything that would prove intent, everything that would tell the story my parents hoped would never be told. Because when survival is on the line, and injustice has been calculated down to the degree, patience, preparation, and precision become the only weapons that matter. I moved slowly through the kitchen, my boots crunching against the thin layer of frost that had settled across the hardwood floors. The heat I had hoped to find wasn't there. Instead, a biting chill clung to every surface, every corner, every object, whispering the story of what had happened in the hours, days, and months before. I opened the refrigerator, expecting the usual assortment of leftovers or something to indicate someone had been maintaining the house. What I found instead felt like a mockery. A bottle of ketchup, a jar of pickles, a block of cheddar cheese rock hard from the cold, nothing else. No vegetables, no meat, no meals prepared for someone who depended entirely on others for survival. The hum of the fridge was the only sound, the only thing still doing its job in the house. Everything else had been abandoned. On the counter, I noticed the row of prescription bottles lined up with unnatural precision, dust-caking their labels. Heart medication, blood thinners, medications meant to keep a 75-year-old man alive and functioning. But the dates told a story. Each one had expired in August, 4 months ago. No refills, no care, no thought given to the fragile life depending on them. My hands shook as I picked one up, turning it over again and again. It wasn't neglect in the way someone forgets to feed a pet or a plant. This was deliberate. Someone had decided that refilling his prescriptions wasn't worth the effort. that maintaining the life of someone old, frail, and dependent could be sacrificed in the name of convenience, of saving a few minutes, of saving a few dollars. I moved to the wall where the smart home thermostat panel hung like an innocuous square of plastic. It was dark, but my mind knew what to do. I tapped the screen and it lit up with the familiar glow of digital life. The interface was clean, unassuming, deceptively cheerful, belying the cruelty it had recorded. I navigated to the history logs, scanning the records with a methodical calm that belied the fury rising inside me. There it was, manual override, user Richard, date stamped, every single action logged in bright numbers, evidence of intention. They hadn't simply forgotten to turn on the heat. They hadn't neglected to check the system or misread the temperature. Someone had deliberately selected disable. Someone had made the conscious choice to let the house and the man inside it freeze. I let my mind rewind, tracing the subtle, insidious steps that had led to this point. This wasn't the work of monsters who shout and make threats. It was the quiet cruelty of those who normalize harm. It begins in small, almost imperceptible ways. Cheap bread instead of fresh. Skipping doctor's appointments because it's a hassle. Ignoring calls until the person calling becomes inconvenient. The neglect piles up slowly, day by day, until it stops being cruelty and becomes routine. Until finally it stops being a question of right or wrong and starts being a calculation of efficiency, of expense. I could see it all now, the months, the years of gradual devaluation. They didn't see George as a human being. They saw him as a burden, a ledger item, a line on a budget they could trim. And in that moment, looking around at the empty fridge, the expired medications, the cold that seemed to seep into the walls themselves, I understood fully how they had arrived at the decision to leave him in a freezing house in the dead of winter. This is how murder happens quietly, I realized. Not with shouting, not with fists, not with knives or guns, with papers, with budgets, with casual, repeated decisions that teach someone that their life is optional, that their survival is negotiable. I walked slowly back through the house, my eyes taking in every detail as if the walls themselves were speaking. The floors creaked under my weight, the draft slipping under doors was a whisper, a reminder of how meticulously they had planned this. The thermostat logs weren't the only evidence. The empty refrigerator, the dust-covered medicine bottles, the careful, deliberate silence, all of it was proof of intent. And the more I examined it, the more the picture became clear. This was a household that had been conditioned over years to view cruelty as normal, to accept neglect as routine, to treat the old man as an expense rather than as family. I thought back to all the subtle, almost invisible ways they had chipped away at his dignity, his independence, his very sense of being. There were the mornings when he was offered stale toast instead of proper meals. The days he was left to sit alone, waiting for someone to notice he needed help. The appointments that were skipped, the calls that went unanswered. None of it happened in a vacuum. None of it was random. Every single act had been rationalized, justified, explained away. And it had worked. Until now. Until the day when the consequence of that quiet cruelty became undeniable. I stood in the kitchen, breathing in the frigid air, and let myself feel the weight of it. Not anger, not grief, not yet, just clarity. I could see the pattern now, and patterns are predictable. Predictable means preventable, correctable, accountable. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, I realized that what they had done was not a mistake. It was a crime. A deliberate, calculated, morally indefensible crime. And the evidence was all around me, silent witnesses to the years of planning, neglect, and cold calculation that had led to this frozen room and the fragile, shivering body lying within it. I took a deep breath, forcing the fog from my lungs and focusing on what I could control. My hands, which had been steady with training but now trembled slightly from adrenaline and cold, moved toward the stack of papers and ledgers they had left behind. Bills unpaid, receipts missing, digital logs, all of it a trail. It was a map of intentional neglect, a road map that would prove beyond question that nothing here had been accidental. I knew that in the eyes of law, intent mattered more than outcome. And I had it. It was written in the frost on the windows, in the dust on the counter, in the digital footprints left by Richard's fingers on the thermostat screen. As I catalogued everything in my mind, I couldn't help but think about how insidious cruelty becomes when it's normalized. It doesn't scream, it doesn't announce itself with violence or confrontation. It creeps in through routine, through the minutiae of everyday life. It convinces people that small sacrifices are harmless, that skipping a medication is a minor inconvenience, that leaving a frail man in a freezing room while vacationing halfway across the world is simply a way to economize. It lulls the conscience to sleep until the line between thoughtless convenience and conscious harm disappears completely. That is what I was looking at now, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. I leaned against the countertop, my hands resting on the cold, smooth surface as I tried to process it all. They didn't just neglect him in the moment. They had spent years preparing him for this, conditioning him to accept that his needs were secondary, that his existence was negotiable. The small, calculated acts of cruelty, cheap food, ignored calls, skipped doctor's appointments, had all built toward this one moment. They had measured, tested, and refined. And then, when the stakes were highest, they had disabled the thermostat, leaving a 75-year-old man in a freezing room while they sipped cocktails on a tropical beach, safe in the knowledge that no one could hold them accountable. The reality of it hit me in a wave that was at once cold and precise. This wasn't a lapse. This wasn't poor judgment. This was an intentional act of harm, executed with the careful hand of someone who had been practicing cruelty for years, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. And in that realization, something clicked inside me. I understood fully the depth of what had been done, the extent of their planning, and the consequences they intended to escape. They hadn't just left a man in the cold. They had left a man to die, and they had calculated every detail to ensure that their hands would appear clean. I walked over to the thermostat again, staring at the small red light blinking in the corner, a beacon of their intent. My mind traced the sequence, Richard's fingers selecting disable, the logs confirming the time and date, the intentional decision to ignore the warnings that should have triggered concern. It was all there, undeniable, irrefutable. Every act leading up to that moment, every overlooked meal, every ignored phone call, every minor deprivation that had seemed harmless at the time, had been a step along a path designed to make a life disposable. And I could see it now, in cold, sharp clarity. This is how murder happens quietly, I thought. Not with sudden violence, not with rage, not with the obvious tools of death. With small, calculated acts repeated over months and years, each one justified in the mind of the perpetrator. Each one rationalized as trivial, inconsequential, necessary. until the cumulative effect is lethal. And now, staring at the evidence of it, feeling the chill of the house seeping into my bones, holding the man who had been treated as disposable in my arms, I understood how close we had come to losing him entirely. I looked around the kitchen again, taking in the full scope of the crime scene. Dusty pill bottles, empty cupboards, frost-crusted windows, a thermostat disabled on purpose, all of it spoke to intent. Every detail, every small act, every calculated omission formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. They hadn't left George to suffer by accident. They hadn't forgotten him in the chaos of a busy life. They had chosen deliberately to place his life in jeopardy. And now, for the first time, I could see it all in its terrifying completeness. The air in the room was sharp, almost bitter, but it did nothing to slow the clarity of my understanding. Every small act of negligence, every tiny, rationalized cruelty, was a thread in a web of deliberate harm. They had treated him like property, like an asset, like a ledger entry. They hadn't seen him as a human being. They had never considered the consequences for him, only the convenience for themselves. And now, in the freezing silence of the house, with the faint pulse returning under my fingers, I knew the truth. This was intentional, calculated, cold. And in that moment I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The evidence was here. The intent was clear. The crime had been committed in quiet, in silence, in the deliberate absence of care. But I had seen it. I had documented it. I had understood it. And now, armed with knowledge and clarity, I was ready for what came next. This wasn't a moment of panic. This wasn't a moment of grief. This was a moment of comprehension, a cold, sharp understanding of the depth of their cruelty. I could feel it in my bones, in my pulse, in the steady rhythm of my hands as I wrapped the blankets tighter around him. I could see the pattern of harm, the insidious nature of normalizing neglect, the way that cruelty, when repeated over time, becomes invisible. I stepped back and took a long look at the room, the kitchen, the house, and the man who had been abandoned. I let the realization settle fully into my mind. They didn't see George as human. They saw him as an expense, a liability, a problem to be managed, minimized, and ultimately ignored. The moral cost, the ethical responsibility, the life of the person they had raised, they had stripped all of it away, one small act at a time. And that, I thought with cold certainty, is how murder happens quietly. 1 week later, the house was no longer a tomb of frost and silence. The air hummed with warmth, a steady 72 degrees that seemed to breathe life back into every corner. The furnace purred quietly, pipes carrying hot water in a steady rhythm, a quiet rebellion against the neglect that had held this place hostage. I sat in my grandfather's favorite leather armchair, feeling the soft, steady heat wash over me. The house smelled of dry wood and the faint, lingering scent of the emergency blankets that had warmed him. I had taken my time restoring it, not just physically, but symbolically. The cold had been erased, the frost melted, and with it the power they thought they had wielded. Through the living room window I saw them, my parents, Richard and Cynthia, striding across the snow with suitcases in hand, laughing loudly as if the Minnesota winter didn't exist. They were dressed for a vacation in some tropical paradise, bright floral shirts clashing with the stark gray of the snow around them. Richard's sunglasses reflected the low winter sun, and Cynthia's straw hat sat precariously on her head. They carried themselves with the arrogance of people who believed the world owed them everything, and that nothing, not even a frozen elderly man, could ever disrupt that entitlement. Their laughter, the careless way they hauled their heavy-duty free bags, made the cold in my chest tighten. When Richard reached the front door and punched in the code, I felt a small, bitter anticipation rise in me. Beep, 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 buzz. Nothing. He frowned. The lock must be frozen, he muttered under his breath, trying the garage keypad. Same result. Red light. Access denied. A hint of confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by irritation. The sense of control he always carried, the smug certainty of ownership, was slipping from him before he even realized it. I walked to the door, calm, deliberate, and opened the deadbolt just wide enough to appear in the threshold. I positioned myself in the opening, a silent barricade, a human reminder that their assumptions about power and entitlement no longer applied. Cynthia's eyes widened as she took in the scene. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice trembling slightly, the smile on her lips faltering. "Where's your grandfather? Is the heat on? We're freezing out here. You're not coming in," I said, my voice flat, measured, and calm. There was no hesitation, no anger, only certainty. I held up a single sheet of paper. "This is an emergency protective order, granted by a judge 3 days ago, based on evidence of elder abuse, endangerment, and malicious neglect. Neither of you is allowed within 100 feet of George, his property, or his assets." Richard's face twisted into disbelief, then fury. "Protective order? Are you insane? This is my house. Get out of my way." His voice rose, unsteady with rage. I didn't flinch. I didn't step aside. I had watched enough chaos, handled enough danger, to know that my calm was my weapon. "It's not your house right now," I said. "It's a crime scene. And you're the suspects." Cynthia's teeth chattered, not from the cold but from shock and indignation. "We went on vacation. We left him perfectly fine. If something happened, that's unfortunate, but you can't lock us out of our own home." Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the door, as if she could physically shove the legal document out of the way. I didn't move. I nodded toward the street. The sheriff's cruiser had just turned the corner, rolling slowly toward the driveway. I had called 5 minutes ago, long enough for the authorities to arrive, and short enough that Richard and Cynthia hadn't realized they were about to lose control entirely. "You have 5 minutes to get off the property," I said, checking my watch, "or you can explain to the sheriff why you disabled the heating system in a home occupied by a 75-year-old man with a heart condition." Richard's face drained of color. The bright, bronzed arrogance of a man confident in his property rights fell away, replaced by the raw panic of entitlement colliding with accountability. "You ungrateful little," he began, but I cut him off. "We raised you, we gave you everything. You gave me nothing, and you gave him less." He jabbed a finger at me, his lips curling, veins bulging. "This is my house," he screamed. His voice cracked under the strain of fury and disbelief. I didn't flinch. I just stepped back slightly and slammed the door behind me, the deadbolt clicking firmly into place. The sound echoed through the quiet snow-covered street, carrying with it the finality of a power shift they hadn't anticipated. Sirens drew closer, their wails cutting through the air with sharp precision. Richard and Cynthia were left standing there, humiliated, shivering despite their tropical clothes, unable to do anything but cower behind entitlement that no longer protected them. The sirens grew louder as the deputies pulled into the driveway, lights flashing, the authority of law converging with the undeniable evidence of their neglect. They had expected to return to a home frozen in compliance with their wishes, a house obedient to their whims. Instead, they found themselves locked out, powerless, accountable. Their expressions twisted from disbelief to anger to fear in a matter of seconds. I stood at the door, silent and composed, a barrier between them and the consequences of their choices. The deputies approached, professional and unflinching. One step forward, notebook in hand, eyes on the parents. "Sir, ma'am, we have a court order signed by Judge Miller," he said, voice steady. "You are to vacate the premises immediately due to a pending investigation into criminal negligence. If you remain on the property in 60 seconds, you will be arrested." Richard opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, the words lost in the sudden awareness that the law, not his anger, now held the power. Cynthia's thin blouse did nothing against the cold Minnesota air. Her arms wrapped around herself as if she could shield herself from reality itself. The bright colors of their vacation clothing mocked them now, a stark contrast to the gray snow, the flashing red and blue lights, and the calm, undeniable authority of the moment. I could see it in their faces, the mixture of confusion, indignation, and fear. For years they had controlled, manipulated, and diminished my grandfather, convinced that their wealth, status, and entitlement would shield them from consequences. But here, now, all of that power was gone, stripped away by a simple piece of paper, by the presence of law enforcement, by the undeniable evidence of their actions. Richard's voice rose again, raw and desperate. "This is my house. You confuse title with power. I own this place. My name is on the deed." He jabbed a finger at the doorframe, a futile attempt to reassert control. I leaned against the frame, arms crossed, voice calm, unwavering. "You bullied an old man into signing away control. You disabled the heat. You endangered his life. It's not your house. It's a crime scene, and you're the suspects." They tried to argue, tried to insist that their actions were just, that nothing could possibly be wrong with their version of events. Cynthia stammered, her words rattling like fragile glass. "We were just protecting him. Protecting him?" I interrupted, letting the incredulity hang in the air like icicles. "You left him to freeze. You didn't just forget to check on him. You turned off the heat while you vacationed in Bali. You didn't refill his prescriptions. You ignored his calls. You dehumanized him for months. That's not protection. That's endangerment. That's elder abuse. And it's documented." The deputies nodded, understanding the situation instantly. They didn't even glance at me. Their focus was entirely on Richard and Cynthia, the culprits of deliberate neglect now confronted by law. One of them stepped forward, holding the protective order, and repeated clearly, "You are required to vacate immediately or face arrest." This is a lawful order, backed by a judge, based on evidence of criminal neglect and endangerment. Richard's face turned a sickly purple as the reality of the situation settled over him. All his years of arrogance, all the power he thought he held through ownership, was gone. Cynthia's hands shook, gripping her straw hat, as the gravity of the moment overtook her. They were no longer the entitled rulers of a house, a family, or a life. They were just two people who had miscalculated, trapped by their own cruelty, exposed in the cold clarity of accountability. I stepped back, letting the door close with authority. The deadbolt clicked again, sealing them out physically and symbolically. The sound resonated in the snow-covered street, mingling with the wail of the sirens, the crunch of boots on ice, the finality of humiliation. The tableau was perfect. They had laughed in my face, assumed control, expected obedience, and now they stood shivering, powerless, witnesses to the reversal of all their calculated control. Through the windows I could see their frustration transform into fear. their entitlement eroding with every passing second. They shouted, they gestured wildly, but the law and the facts of their actions surrounded them like an invisible barrier. They couldn't argue, they couldn't manipulate. Their usual tools of coercion, charm, and control had been stripped away, leaving only the undeniable consequences of their deliberate choices. I let the moments stretch, letting the humiliation settle in their bones. There was no triumph in my expression, no anger in my posture, only calm and control. I was the observer now, the enforcer of the justice that had been long delayed but now arrived in full force. The sound of the sirens grew louder, echoing across the neighborhood, signaling that authority had arrived, that the reversal of power was complete. Richard and Cynthia finally moved toward the taxi waiting at the curb, their faces a mix of fury, disbelief, and shame. They stumbled over the snow, dragging their heavy suitcases, unable to reconcile their expectations with reality. Every step was a reminder that the house they had treated as a playground for cruelty was no longer theirs, that the person they had underestimated, trained, disciplined, and prepared was now the one in control. As the taxi drove away, the house behind me was finally silent, warm, and safe. The sirens faded, leaving only the steady hum of the furnace and the soft crackle of heat moving through the radiators. Outside, the world was cold, but inside, order had been restored. Their laughter, their entitlement, their sense of invincibility had all been erased. And for the first time in years, the house felt like home again, not because it was restored physically, but because justice had finally arrived, quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. The legal battle began quietly, but with precision, like the opening moves of a chess game where every piece is positioned with intent. I knew their entitlement wouldn't survive the cold logic of law, so I started by freezing every financial lever they had at their disposal. Every credit card in George's name was locked down the moment the ambulance left the driveway. By the time Richard and Cynthia tried to pay for their luxury hotel at Dooth's most expensive property, the transaction declined, leaving them blinking at the screen in disbelief. Their sense of control, already fragile from the earlier humiliation, began to crumble. They thought money could bend the world to their will, but I had anticipated every move, and the chessboard had shifted beneath their feet. It wasn't long before they realized they couldn't regain control through conventional means. In desperation, they filed for emergency guardianship, portraying me as an unstable combat veteran who had kidnapped George to steal his assets. The narrative was absurd, and yet it was the kind of smear campaign designed to confuse and intimidate. Friends, family, and even strangers might have questioned my motives if the story had been presented without context. That was the beauty of strategy, anticipation, preparation, and patience. I expected these attacks and had already positioned myself to counteract them, not with rage, but with evidence, clarity, and legal leverage. I hired Elias Thorne, a property litigator with a reputation for ruthlessness and brilliance. He was the kind of man who saw through bluster and entitlement and understood the subtle power embedded in law. We worked quickly, reviewing the house's ownership documents, the life estate clause, and every transaction or action Richard and Cynthia had taken that violated fiduciary duty. To explain it simply, George owned the life estate. He was the life tenant, meaning that the house, its use, and its protection were his for life. Richard and Cynthia were remainder men. They could only take ownership after George's death, and even then they had a legal duty not to damage or devalue the property. Every action they had taken, from shutting off the heat to neglecting prescriptions, directly violated that duty. In plain terms, they owned the future, but they destroyed the present. The evidence was undeniable. The thermostat logs, with every manual override time-stamped and labeled with Richard's user account, showed intent. They didn't forget to turn on the heat, they actively disabled it while George was left alone, vulnerable, and freezing. The burst pipes and resulting flood damage in the basement were a direct consequence of their actions. That combination, intent plus damage, was exactly the kind of legal leverage we needed to demonstrate malicious voluntary waste. It was no longer a matter of moral outrage, it was a matter of law, clear and indisputable. As we approached the courtroom, the tension was almost theatrical. Richard and Cynthia, previously confident and arrogant, entered with forced composure, attempting to present a facade of concern and entitlement. Their lawyer tried to frame me as unstable, to distract from the facts, to turn emotion against logic. But Elias Thorne had prepared meticulously. We presented the life estate clause in clear, simple language, walked the judge through the thermostat logs, and showed photographs of the flood damage caused by burst pipes after the heat had been disabled. Each piece of evidence told a story. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate, calculated, and malicious. The courtroom became a stage for accountability. I sat quietly, calm, letting the facts speak. Each photograph, each log, each legal precedent built an unbroken chain linking intent to consequence. Richard's expression changed gradually, from indignation to disbelief, then to panic, as the implications became clear. Cynthia's attempts to smirk or interject fell flat. Every word we spoke reinforced the inescapable logic of the case. Malicious neglect was no longer abstract. It was documented, time-stamped, and undeniable. Thorne delivered the key line with surgical precision. You own the future. You destroyed the present. The words hung in the courtroom, resonating with the judge and sealing the intellectual and emotional victory. The combination of deliberate acts, documented intent, and visible damage made the case impossible to contest. The life estate clause ensured that ownership could not be transferred under these conditions. Every action Richard and Cynthia had taken now worked against them, and the law, not anger, determined the outcome. Finally, the judge rendered the decision. The deed was voided. Ownership reverted to George immediately, and the emergency guardianship was dismissed with prejudice. The hammer of justice fell with precision, leaving no room for appeal or reinterpretation. Richard and Cynthia's entire plan had collapsed. They had tried to manipulate the system, exploit loopholes, and leverage entitlement, but their own actions had become the trap. The courtroom echoed with the quiet power of meticulous preparation, careful observation, and patient strategy. The aftermath was almost surreal. Richard and Cynthia, once so confident, were now utterly powerless. Their schemes to control, manipulate, and profit from George's vulnerability had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. They had underestimated the consequences of deliberate cruelty and overestimated their ability to hide behind wealth and status. In contrast, the methodical, calm approach of documenting evidence, freezing assets, and leveraging legal expertise had ensured that justice was delivered efficiently and completely. Throughout the entire process, I never raised my voice, never lost my composure, and never allowed my personal anger to dictate actions. The victory was intellectual as much as it was emotional. This was not about revenge in the heat of the moment. It was about a strategic, deliberate dismantling of the power they thought they held. Every move, every countermeasure, every legal maneuver was executed with the precision of someone trained to anticipate threats, assess risk, and act decisively under pressure. By the time we left the courthouse, the house and George's rights had been fully restored. The life estate remained intact, ensuring that the property could never again be weaponized against him while he lived. Richard and Cynthia had been humiliated in the process, their credibility destroyed, their entitlement checked by facts, law, and evidence. The legal battle, far from being a mere formality, had become the ultimate demonstration of calculated power, chess over checkers, patience over impulse, intellect over arrogance. Even in the quiet aftermath, the satisfaction was subtle but profound. Justice was no longer a matter of hope or emotion. It was embedded in the legal structure, undeniable and permanent. The house was safe, George was protected, and the perpetrators had been stripped of their ability to harm him further. This chapter of the story wasn't about anger or vengeance in the traditional sense. It was about precision, intellect, and the systematic application of strategy to correct a wrong that had been years in the making. The courtroom, once a place of tension and potential chaos, had become the proving ground for every careful decision I had made. From freezing assets to documenting every act of neglect, from analyzing the thermostat logs to photographing the damage, every action had been part of a larger, coherent plan. Richard and Cynthia's attempts to smear me or regain control had been anticipated and neutralized before they could gain traction. Every step reinforced the fundamental lesson. When calculated cruelty meets methodical preparation, the law becomes a force for restoration, not just punishment. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the legal war had not only corrected a wrong, but also established a precedent for accountability. The combination of evidence, legal expertise, and patient strategy ensured that the injustice Richard and Cynthia had inflicted could not be repeated. Every document, every photo, every log had contributed to a narrative that was indisputable, a story of intentional neglect, exposure, and ultimate justice. The aftermath of the legal war unfolded slowly, almost deliberately, like the final moves of a carefully played game that had taken years to set up. Richard and Cynthia were no longer the confident, entitled figures who had laughed their way across the Minnesota snow just a few weeks earlier. Instead, they were two people exposed and diminished, stripped of every tool they had used to manipulate, control, and endanger. Watching them in the days after the courtroom verdict was almost surreal. Their fighting began almost immediately, sharp and petty, fueled by disbelief and anger that had no outlet in logic or law. Every word was a jab, every gesture a silent accusation, but with no leverage left, no legal or financial ammunition to wield, their clashes were purely performative, bitter shadows of the power they once assumed was theirs by default. The first day after the ruling, they arrived at the house again, hoping to assert some sort of authority, some semblance of control over George or the property. But every step they took was met with invisible barriers constructed by law, oversight, and careful planning. Each of them believed that perhaps, with enough cunning, they could manipulate the situation, find a loophole, or pressure George into a concession. They didn't realize that the legal victory wasn't just a momentary win, it was a permanent shift, a structural change that left them exposed and impotent. Richard, usually the loudest, would throw his weight around, banging on doors and demanding access, only for Cynthia to counter with sharp, defensive retorts. Their voices echoed in the halls, but no one listened, no one obeyed. Without leverage, every argument was hollow, every attempt at intimidation meaningless. They were heirs to nothing, their inheritance evaporated along with their carefully constructed fade of authority. Meanwhile, George, the center of the entire conflict, began to recover. His body, previously weakened by cold and neglect, responded to warmth, nourishment, and care. The hospital had stabilized him, but the homecoming was a careful, intentional process. We worked together to restore his life, not just his house, to repair the damage of years of emotional and physical neglect. The house, once a place of cold calculations and cruelty, was slowly transformed into a sanctuary. Repairs were done properly by honest workers with attention to detail that reflected not only the structural integrity of the property, but also its symbolic significance. Walls were repaired, floors replaced where warped by freezing and flooding, plumbing reconnected and reinforced to prevent future sabotage. Every renovation, every fresh coat of paint, every repaired fixture was a quiet statement. The house would no longer be a tool for abuse. It was no longer a weapon in Richard and Cynthia's hands. It was a safe, dignified home for George. As the repairs progressed, George began to regain both physical strength and a sense of autonomy. He could move through the house without fear, access every room safely, and enjoy the warmth that had been denied to him for so long. The transformation wasn't only physical, it was emotional, a reclamation of dignity and control that had been systematically stripped away over the years. He started to regain the small joys that come from living with comfort and certainty, a hot cup of coffee by the window, a blanket draped over his shoulders while reading the morning paper, the hum of a properly functioning heating system that never faltered. These were simple things, but in the context of everything he had endured, they were profound victories, quiet affirmations of life and resilience. During this time, discussions about the future of the property and George's estate began. He wanted to ensure that no one could ever manipulate or exploit him, or anyone else, in the way Richard and Cynthia had. It became clear that the house would not remain a family inheritance in the traditional sense. Instead, George decided to write a new will, one that reflected both his values and the lessons learned from the abuse he had suffered at the hands of those he had once trusted. The decision was deliberate. The house would be donated to a veterans' retreat, a place where people who had sacrificed for others could live and heal without fear, neglect, or manipulation. It was a symbolic act as much as a practical one. He had been betrayed, endangered, and dehumanized, but through this act, he turned the instrument of his suffering into a vehicle for care, support, and restoration. I was named the executor of this estate, a role that carried enormous responsibility and trust. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or a hollow title. It was a recognition of both the experience I had gained and the care, strategy, and precision I had applied to ensure George's safety. As executor, I would oversee the transformation of the property, ensuring that it became a place of healing rather than harm, and that no one could ever use it as a tool for exploitation. The responsibility was immense, but I embraced it fully, knowing that every decision, every measure of oversight would honor the resilience George had shown and the justice that had finally been delivered. Richard and Cynthia, meanwhile, were left with nothing. No inheritance, no leverage, no legal foothold. Their power had been thoroughly dismantled. Attempts to manipulate or threaten were met with calm authority, legal barriers, and undeniable evidence of their own malicious intent. Their previous strategies, coercion, intimidation, exploitation, were now irrelevant. Every move they made only highlighted their impotence and exposed their failure to the world. It was a rare sight, people so used to control, now completely powerless, reduced to arguing with each other over scraps of dignity that had no legal or practical standing. There was a strange, almost poetic justice in watching them stumble through the consequences of their choices. They had spent years meticulously calculating how to benefit from George's life and property, thinking themselves clever in the manipulation of assets and trust. Yet, in their own arrogance, they had miscalculated the one thing they had failed to account for: accountability. The law, evidence, and careful planning had converged to ensure that their cruelty could not stand. Each attempt to assert control now backfired, every action a reminder of the power they had lost, every argument a testament to the gap between entitlement and reality. Through all of this, George's recovery became the anchor for everything else. As he regained strength, it became clear that the damage Richard and Cynthia intended to inflict, emotionally, financially, physically, had been contained. The house, restored and reinforced, was a fortress, not of walls and locks alone, but of justice, preparation, and oversight. George's health stabilized, his routines returned, and he began to live in a space where safety, warmth, and dignity were constants rather than privileges. The new will he drafted was comprehensive and carefully constructed. Beyond the house, he took measures to protect any other assets or items of value from the kind of manipulation he had endured. His focus was on permanence and security, ensuring that no one could exploit trust or entitlement again. The Veterans Retreat was not just a gift, it was a safeguard, a legacy designed to turn a place once marked by neglect and danger into one of healing and service. Every clause, every stipulation, every detail was deliberately crafted to ensure that the house, the property, and the associated resources could never again be weaponized against the vulnerable. For me, as executor, the role was both practical and symbolic. I managed the transition, oversaw renovations, coordinated with legal and construction teams, and ensured that George's vision was implemented fully. Each decision reflected the lessons learned from the ordeal, vigilance, care, foresight, and the certainty that justice was not only about retribution, but about restoration. The transformation of the house mirrored the transformation in George's life, a restoration of safety, dignity, and purpose after years of calculated neglect and cruelty. Richard and Cynthia, meanwhile, could only watch. Their attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or regain access were met with calm, firm barriers, legal authority, and the undeniable reality of George's ownership and well-being. They had expected to control the narrative, to extract wealth and power from their father, and to assert dominance over me in the process. But the combination of evidence, legal strategy, and moral clarity had left them powerless. Every argument, every gesture, every attempt to assert entitlement only highlighted their failure, their disconnection from reality, and their moral and practical impotence. Their fighting became almost a public spectacle, a series of petty, self-contained eruptions that underscored the collapse of their perceived authority. Without inheritance, without leverage, without legal power, they were trapped in the consequences of their own cruelty. No longer could they manipulate George or the house. No longer could they exploit trust or status. Their entire structure of control had been dismantled, leaving only frustration, anger, and mutual blame. As spring arrived, George's recovery was fully evident. He moved through the house with energy, clarity, and independence. The once frozen corridors were now warm and inviting, the smell of fresh paint, clean wood, and restored floors filling the air. Every room reflected the care and attention that had been invested, not only in repairs, but in creating a safe, sustainable, and comfortable environment. The house had transformed from a symbol of neglect and cruelty into one of stability, warmth, and hope. George's new will ensured that the house and its assets could no longer be weaponized or exploited. It became a permanent legacy dedicated to veterans, a community for healing and care. He entrusted me as executor, confident that the principles of accountability, vigilance, and foresight that had saved him from harm would continue to guide the property in its mission. The culmination of years of neglect, danger, and abuse had been met with meticulous planning, legal precision, and moral clarity, resulting in a permanent shift in power and security. The emotional resonance of the entire process cannot be overstated. George had been endangered by those who were supposed to protect him, yet through careful preparation, strategy, and the judicious application of law and evidence, his life was preserved and his autonomy restored. The house, once a stage for cruelty and neglect, had been transformed into a sanctuary, a symbol of resilience and justice. Richard and Cynthia, for all their confidence and entitlement, had been rendered powerless. They had waited for his death, thinking it would secure them wealth, control, and satisfaction. Instead, his life, his recovery, and the careful, strategic application of justice erased them from any position of power or influence. They waited for his death. Instead, his life erased them. That simple line encapsulated the finality of the consequences. The abuse, the neglect, the calculated cruelty had all been confronted and neutralized. The perpetrators had no recourse, no leverage, no influence over the outcome. George's life, combined with strategic action, evidence, and legal authority, became the instrument of justice. The victory was not born from rage or impulsive action, but from patience, preparation, and unyielding focus on preserving life, dignity, and rights. By the time the house was fully restored and the veterans' retreat operational, Richard and Cynthia were completely removed from the picture. Their attempts to exert influence or regain access had been systematically blocked. Their anger, frustration, and disbelief were the only remnants of the power they had once imagined. George's health and autonomy were intact. The house was safe and functional, and the new legal and moral structures ensured that the past abuses could not be repeated. The restoration was complete, not only physically, but emotionally, legally, and morally. In the end, the consequences were both thorough and lasting. The perpetrators were stripped of power, resources, and influence. The victim regained autonomy, safety, and dignity. The house, once a tool for manipulation and cruelty, became a place of healing and restoration. And the legal and strategic measures taken ensured that these outcomes were permanent, secure, and resilient. The story concluded not with vengeance in the moment, but with a systematic, lasting restoration of justice. George's life, preserved and honored, became the ultimate corrective force, and the house, transformed and protected, stood as a testament to the triumph of patience, preparation, and unwavering commitment to justice. The story doesn't end with a courtroom gavel or the sound of doors slamming. It ends in the quiet after the storm, in the reflection that comes when the dust settles, the sirens fade, and life begins to return to a semblance of normalcy. Standing in the restored warmth of George's home, I couldn't help but think about the strange duality of the cold and the heat, how they had acted almost like silent witnesses to the truth of what had happened. The freezing temperatures, both literal and metaphorical, had preserved evidence in ways that no one had anticipated. The smart thermostat logs, the frozen pipes, the brittle walls, even the residual chill in the basement, they were not just remnants of neglect or malice, they were irrefutable proof, concrete manifestations of intent that could not be dismissed, spun, or rationalized away. It was ironic, almost poetic, that the very cruelty Richard and Cynthia had attempted to disguise through convenience and distance had instead become their undoing. The cold had kept the truth intact, immutable, undeniable, while they sipped cocktails on a distant beach, convinced that time and warmth would erase their traces. But while the cold preserved evidence, the restoration of heat revealed the human consequences of their actions. George's shivering body, blue lips, and frail pulse were not abstractions. They were visceral reminders that neglect is more than an inconvenience. It is a moral and physical danger. The warmth we restored wasn't just a temperature, it was a revelation, a mirror showing exactly what had been risked, what had been endangered, and the fragile boundary between life and death. Heat exposed their guilt, not in accusations or shouted confrontations, but in the simple, undeniable reality that someone had suffered because of deliberate, conscious choices. The juxtaposition was striking, cold as silent testimony, heat as living confirmation. Together, they told the story more effectively than any argument, lawyer, or courtroom could. The truth doesn't need embellishment. It exists in evidence and consequence, in the spaces between actions and outcomes, and in the unbroken line from negligence to recovery. I often think about justice and what it really means. In a world obsessed with dramatic vengeance, it's easy to imagine that retribution requires violence, confrontation, or overt punishment. But that's a shallow understanding, a cinematic fantasy of morality. True justice, I realized, doesn't demand rage, it demands clarity, patience, and preparation. The dismantling of Richard and Cynthia's power was methodical, deliberate, and largely invisible until the moment it was undeniable. Freezing their access to money, documenting every action, understanding the legal frameworks like the life estate clause, hiring the right expertise at the right time, these were acts of strategy, not anger. They required discipline, foresight, and emotional control. There were no explosive confrontations, no physical retaliation, no impulsive decisions, yet the consequences were absolute, permanent, and far-reaching. Justice didn't need violence to assert itself. The law, evidence, and strategy became instruments of accountability, turning patience and preparation into a more powerful weapon than any impulse could ever achieve. Watching George slowly regain his strength, witnessing him reclaim his home and his life, the emotional satisfaction was profound but quiet. It wasn't about triumph over individuals, it was about restoration. The house became a sanctuary, the property a shield, and the consequences of their cruelty a permanent lesson. Richard and Cynthia, despite every attempt to manipulate, coerce, or intimidate, were powerless. Their entitlement, arrogance, and greed had collided with methodical preparation and ethical rigor, and the result was clear: no inheritance, no leverage, no recourse. They had believed that time, distance, and manipulation could erase the consequences of their actions. Instead, the meticulous attention to detail, the careful collection of evidence, and the structured application of law preserved the truth and ensured accountability. Their failure wasn't dramatic. It was absolute, structural, and enduring. The moral clarity of the situation resonated far beyond the confines of George's home. It became apparent that cruelty is not always loud, and malice is not always dramatic. Often the most insidious acts happen slowly, in the incremental erosion of care, attention, and respect. Cheap substitutions, skipped appointments, ignored calls. These are the subtle ways that neglect accumulates, shaping lives and endangering those who trust too easily. Richard and Cynthia hadn't made one catastrophic mistake. They had made hundreds of quiet, deliberate decisions, each seemingly insignificant, each building toward a moment of extreme danger for George. Understanding that pattern, recognizing it, and acting with both patience and precision is how real accountability is achieved. Justice is not reactive, it is anticipatory, strategic, and relentless in its adherence to principle. As executor of the restored estate and overseer of George's recovery, I had the rare opportunity to witness the ripple effects of measured justice. The house was transformed, not just physically but morally, into a place of security, dignity, and purpose. Every repair, every renovation, every adjustment to the property was a reaffirmation that justice isn't about retaliation, it's about creating conditions where wrongdoing cannot persist. The veterans' retreat, the new will, the protections embedded into the estate, all of these were measures that extended accountability beyond the immediate conflict. They ensured that the suffering inflicted by Richard and Cynthia could not be repeated, not by them, not by anyone else. Their failure became a permanent boundary, a structural lesson in consequence, carefully built on the foundations of strategy, evidence, and patience. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, it became evident that the narrative of the story, the unfolding of neglect, discovery, confrontation, and restoration, was as much about understanding human behavior as it was about securing justice. Richard and Cynthia had operated under the assumption that emotional distance and material control equated to power. They underestimated patience, foresight, and intelligence. They assumed cruelty could be hidden, that negligence could be rationalized, that entitlement could overcome truth. They didn't account for the meticulous application of strategy, guided by both empathy and ethical clarity. That gap between expectation and reality became the vector of justice, and it was remarkably precise. Every action they had taken that sought to harm George became evidence against them. Every attempt to assert dominance was neutralized before it could gain traction. The moral lesson was unambiguous. Cruelty, even calculated and incremental, carries consequences when met with intelligence, vigilance, and patience. And then there is the human element, the emotional resonance that cannot be reduced to logic or law. Watching George recover, witnessing his independence, seeing the house transformed into a safe and nurturing environment brought a sense of closure that was profoundly human. The consequences inflicted on Richard and Cynthia were not born of anger or personal vendetta, they were the natural result of ethical and legal accountability. Their suffering was a byproduct of justice, not its aim. That distinction is crucial. True satisfaction comes not from seeing someone punished in the moment, but from knowing that integrity, preparation, and diligence have preserved life, dignity, and fairness. It is the slow, deliberate alignment of consequence with action that provides emotional resolution, the quiet but enduring sense that right has prevailed over manipulation. Even now, as I reflect on that period, I realize how much the interplay between cold and heat defined the entire arc. The freezing temperatures preserved evidence, maintaining the integrity of every act of malice, while the restored warmth revealed the human cost, making the consequences of their cruelty undeniable. Together they created a framework for truth that no argument, lie, or entitlement could dismantle. It is a lesson that extends far beyond the story of one family, far beyond the walls of a single house in Minnesota. It is a principle that applies wherever manipulation, cruelty, and negligence intersect with opportunity. Truth will always find a way to endure, and when it does, the structures built on malice will inevitably collapse. The final emotional resonance rests in the permanence of consequence. Richard and Cynthia cannot undo what has been done, cannot reclaim the influence they once believed was theirs. Their power, built on incremental cruelty and entitlement, has been neutralized permanently. George's recovery, the restoration of the house, the establishment of the Veterans Retreat, and the structural protections embedded in the estate ensure that no repetition is possible. The lesson is clear. Patience, preparation, and moral clarity can achieve justice more effectively than any act of immediate retaliation. The quiet satisfaction lies in permanence, in the systemic eradication of abuse, and in the restoration of dignity and life. And yet, the story also carries a broader reflection on human behavior, morality, and the choices that define us. Richard and Cynthia had made a series of small, seemingly inconsequential decisions, skipping medical appointments, ignoring calls, choosing convenience over care, that compounded into near-lethal consequences. These are the incremental actions that erode trust, humanity, and life itself. It is not always dramatic or immediate sometimes. It is quiet, unnoticed, and normalized over years. Recognizing these patterns, anticipating their consequences, and acting strategically is the difference between helplessness and empowerment, between chaos and justice. In that sense, the story transcends family conflict or legal strategy. It becomes a lesson in vigilance, ethics, and the slow accumulation of accountability. The finality of it all is encapsulated in a simple yet profound truth. They thought the cold would destroy him. They believed that neglect, distance, and selfish calculation could erase responsibility, diminish life, and secure their advantage. Instead, the cold preserved the truth. Every act of malice, every deliberate choice, every incremental abuse was recorded in evidence, frozen in place, undeniable. And when the thaw came, when warmth, restoration, and strategic action entered the picture, it washed them away. The system of accountability, patience, and preparation swept over the fragile constructs of entitlement and cruelty, leaving nothing but clarity, restoration, and justice. That is the ultimate moral. Cruelty, no matter how calculated, cannot endure in the face of preparedness, truth, and strategic action. And for anyone watching, there is a soft but essential takeaway. If this story made you feel something, if the tension, the indignation, the ultimate satisfaction resonated, it is because the principles at work are universal. It isn't about family or Minnesota or a single house. It is about how patience, preparation, and strategic action can counteract even the most deliberate cruelty. It is about how truth, preserved and revealed, ensures justice without the need for explosive retaliation. And it is about the quiet but profound power of aligning moral clarity with action. In the end, the story leaves us with a sense of completion, not because someone was humiliated or punished, but because life, truth, and justice were restored in a lasting, meaningful way. It reminds us that the consequences of cruelty, however incremental or hidden, are inescapable when met with vigilance, intellect, and integrity. And it reinforces the timeless lesson that patience, preparation, and the careful application of principle will always outlast arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty. They thought the cold would destroy him. It preserved the truth. And when the thaw came, it washed them away. If this story made you feel something, you already know why you stayed. It is a reminder that integrity, preparation, and moral courage create ripples far larger than immediate action. It is a lesson not only in justice, but in life, that even in the harshest conditions, truth endures, cruelty falters, and patient, deliberate action triumphs.